There is a press conference from March 2008 that most NASCAR fans remember, not for what was said, but for the specific way it was said. Jack Roush, Panama hat, standing at a podium, accusing a Toyota team of stealing a sway bar from his shop, calling them thieves, threatening legal action, invoking Pearl Harbor, calling them ankle-biting chihuahuas. And somewhere across the garage, Michael Waltrip, listening. Knowing exactly who Roush was talking about, even though Roush refused to say the name out loud. This is that story. Not the story of a simple parts dispute. Not the story of a missing piece of metal that eventually found its way back to the team it belonged to. The story of two men who represented completely opposite visions of what NASCAR was and what it should become, and who collided with a force that neither of them ever quite recovered from. Michael Waltrip and Jack Roush. One man who built his life around making friends and finding the humor in everything. One man who built his career around making enemies and winning every argument he entered. They were never going to coexist quietly. Before the war started, Jack Roush arrived in NASCAR in 1988 with a driver named Mark Martin and a philosophy that had never changed across 40 years of building race cars. His cars would be American. His engines would be American. The people he competed against would drive American iron, or they would not have his respect. He was born in Kentucky. He grew up in Ohio. He went to work for Ford and never left. Not really, because Ford was not just a manufacturer to Jack Roush. It was a statement of identity, of loyalty, of what American racing was supposed to represent. He won championships. He won Daytona 500s. He built one of the most successful organizations in the history of the sport. And throughout all of it, he was the most vocal, most aggressive, most unapologetically confrontational team owner in the garage. The Cat in the Hat. That was his nickname. From the Panama hat he wore to every race. The one that became as recognizable as his voice. But underneath the hat was something harder than the nickname suggested. A man who kept score, who never forgot a slight, who treated every competitive interaction as an extension of a war that never really ended. Michael Waltrip arrived in NASCAR 2 years before Roush did, in 1985, with a very different philosophy. He was Darrell's little brother, the funny one, the one who could walk into a room full of people who should have been his enemies and leave with all of them smiling. He went 462 consecutive Cup starts without winning a race, and somehow maintained a reputation as one of the most beloved figures in the garage. Because the way he lost was so honest and so human that people could not help rooting for him. For 15 years, these two men shared a garage without the kind of friction that makes history. They competed. They were occasionally in each other's way. But the war had not yet started. It started with Toyota. The ankle-biting chihuahuas. Toyota announces it is coming to NASCAR. For most of the garage, this was business, a new manufacturer, more money in the sport, more competition, the way things evolve. For Jack Roush, it was something else entirely. He held press conferences about it. He gave interviews about it. He called the Toyota team's ankle-biting chihuahuas, a phrase so specific and so aggressive that it became the defining quote of the entire Toyota controversy. He invoked Pearl Harbor. He stood at microphones and made clear, in language that left no room for ambiguity, that the arrival of a Japanese manufacturer in American stock car racing was something he considered a personal affront and a competitive betrayal. Michael Waltrip was not just watching from the sidelines. He was the face of Toyota's arrival. When Toyota decided to come to NASCAR, they needed an American driver, someone the fans knew, and someone who represented the sport's values, someone who could stand in front of a camera and make the whole thing feel natural rather than foreign. They chose the lovable loser from Kentucky who had finally won a race, 2 Daytona 500s actually, and who had the kind of personality that made even skeptical NASCAR fans willing to give something new a chance. Michael Waltrip Racing became Toyota's flagship team, the first full-time 3-car Toyota operation in the Cup Series. the public face of everything Jack Roush was fighting against, and Roush made sure everyone knew exactly how he felt about it. The rocket fuel February 2007, the Daytona 500. Michael Waltrip Racing had worked all off-season to build a car that could compete. The pressure was enormous. This was Toyota's debut in the Cup Series, and the whole sport was watching. I fail here, and the entire project could be called into question before it properly started. During qualifying at Daytona, NASCAR inspectors found something in the intake manifold of Waltrip's car, an illegal substance, a fuel additive that had no business being there, something that increased power beyond what the rules allowed. The crew chief and team director were removed from the speedway immediately. Waltrip was docked 100 points and fined $100,000. The team was forced to run backup cars. Before Toyota had taken a competitive lap in the Cup Series, the manufacturer's flagship team was under the cloud of a cheating scandal on national television. The press conference afterward was painful. Waltrip stood at the podium looking like exactly what he was. A man who had just watched the worst possible thing happen at the worst possible moment. He apologized. He said he did not fully understand what had happened. He said the team would cooperate with every investigation. Jack Roush did not miss the opportunity. He made clear, publicly and without apology, that the rocket fuel incident was exactly what he had been warning everyone about. That Toyota's arrival in NASCAR came with a different standard of conduct. That the ankle-biting Chihuahuas had shown their teeth on the biggest stage in the sport. Michael Waltrip heard every word. The stolen sway bar, September 2007. Dover International Speedway. In the post-race chaos of the garage, 43 teams breaking down equipment, loading haulers, and mechanics from different organizations moving through shared spaces, a sway bar belonging to Roush Fenway Racing disappeared from beneath their toolbox. By January 2008, Roush had figured out where it went. A mechanic who had worked for the Toyota team confirmed he had seen the bar in their shop. The bar had been built to Roush's specific design specifications for the new car of tomorrow, and the Toyota team's development manager had contacted the vendor who built it for Roush, asking if they would duplicate it to the same specifications. Jack Roush held a press conference. He called it theft. He called it intellectual espionage. He said his team had been damaged and harmed. And he referenced the missing paint on the bar. He claimed it had been sandblasted off to remove the identifying marks, and said the whole thing was as clear-cut as anything he had ever seen in 22 years in the business. He declined to name Michael Waltrip Racing specifically. He did not need to. There were only 2 Toyota teams at Dover that weekend. The entire garage knew exactly who he was talking about. Waltrip's response was the only one available to him. The measured, careful language of a man trying to manage a crisis that kept getting larger. Accidents happen. Mistakes happen. When they realized the bar was not theirs, they set it aside. When Roush's team called to inquire about it in January, they gave it back. It was not theft. It was a confusion of parts in a garage area where such confusions happened every single weekend. NASCAR investigated. NASCAR concluded that the Toyota teams had done nothing wrong. Robin Pemberton, the vice president of competition, said disappearing parts were a common occurrence and teams needed to work it out themselves. Roush was not satisfied. He said there were people ready to sweep dirt under the rug. He said NASCAR did not have adequate rules to deal with theft. He said the situation was fundamentally different from a misplaced part, that the attempt to have the bar duplicated proved deliberate intent. Jeff Gordon said he hoped Roush was not taking it seriously because he should not be. Waltrip said accidents happen in a garage with 70 race vehicles all competing for the same space. And somewhere between those 2 positions was the truth, a truth that nobody could fully establish and that both sides were certain they already knew. What it actually was here is what the Jack Roush versus Michael Waltrip conflict was really about. Not a sway bar, not rocket fuel, not even Toyota versus Ford in the narrow sense of 2 manufacturers competing for wins. It was about identity. Jack Roush had built his entire career on a specific vision of what NASCAR was, an American sport built by American manufacturers, sustained by a culture of loyalty to those manufacturers that went deeper than competitive strategy. Ford was not a sponsorship decision for Roush, it was a conviction. When Toyota arrived and the man standing in front of the cameras welcoming them was Michael Waltrip, beloved, familiar, and the lovable loser who had become a champion. It felt to Roush like a betrayal of something fundamental. Not just a business decision, a statement about what the sport valued and what it was willing to accept. Waltrip had made his choice. He had looked at the opportunity Toyota offered and decided it was the right path for his team, his career, and his future in the sport. It was a legitimate decision, a reasonable decision, one that many other people in the same position would have made. But to Roush, watching from beneath his Panama hat with 40 years of American racing in his bones, it was the wrong decision. And he said so, repeatedly, loudly, in every available forum, with every available word. Michael Waltrip was not just a competitor to Jack Roush. He was the face of everything Roush was fighting against. The smiling, personable, impossibly likable ambassador for the foreign takeover that Roush had spent years warning was coming. You cannot fight someone who everyone likes. You cannot make an enemy of the lovable loser. The argument was always going to go against Roush in the court of public opinion. But Roush did not make the argument for public opinion. He made it because he believed it. He made it in the same way he made every argument, completely, loudly, and without a moment's consideration of whether the audience was with him. Michael Waltrip survived the rocket fuel scandal. He survived the sway bar accusations. He built his team into one of the most competitive organizations in the sport for a period in the early 2000s. 3 cars, multiple wins, legitimate championship contenders. And then came Richmond 2013 and Spingate, the manipulation scandal that finally ended what the rocket fuel and the sway bar could not. The team that Waltrip had fought to build was dismantled not by Jack Roush, but by its own choices in the closing laps of a September race. Roush never needed to win the argument. Waltrip's team eventually destroyed itself. But the war between them, the specific, personal, ideological war between a man who stood for Toyota and a man who stood for Ford, had been burning since 2003. It burned through press conferences and penalty hearings and missing parts and rocket fuel scandals. It burned through every public statement either man made about the other. It never really stopped burning. It just stopped mattering when there was nothing left to fight over. This channel finds the stories underneath the results, the wars that were fought in press conferences and parking lots and garage areas while the cameras were pointed somewhere else. Subscribe? Because the best NASCAR stories were never the ones about who crossed the finish line first. They were the ones about who was still fighting when the race was long over.